The listing caught my eye one quiet evening while scrolling through the county auction website. $12,000 for a three-bedroom farmhouse in Maple Hollow, Ohio. Even rundown trailers were twice that price. Something about the photo felt off. The faded white siding looked almost cheerful in the sunlight, the giant oak tree in front lending a sense of stability. Despite the peeling paint and crooked porch, I'd recently lost my city job and endured a messy divorce. A project, a restart, that's what I told myself. A chance to rebuild, to reclaim control. Driving into Maple Hollow the morning of the auction, I felt a mixture of excitement and unease. The town was frozen in a nostalgic bubble. Kids riding bikes, a diner with hand-painted signs, and locals nodding as if recognizing every newcomer. I parked near the gravel road that led to the McCreary house and walked the last mile on foot. Up close, the house was rougher than the photo. Cracked shutters, sagging steps, and overgrown weeds. But there was something welcoming in its crookedness. Something patient. The auction was short, just under 10 minutes. No one else bid. The locals glanced at me sideways and one man muttered, "Poor guy." I forced a smile and tried to ignore him. I got the keys from the clerk who hesitated, giving me a look that seemed to weigh the house's history more than my offer. "Good luck," she said, but her eyes were far away. I shrugged, chalking it up to small-town wariness. That night, I moved in with only an air mattress and a box of essentials. The house smelled of dust and old wood, the silence almost oppressive. Around midnight, I was startled by a dull thud from somewhere below. My heart jumped. The house was settling, I reasoned. Old pipes, old boards, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to sleep, but my mind kept circling back to the basement door. 3 thick bolts sealed it from the outside. I couldn't stop thinking, why would anyone lock a basement from the outside? And then, the next morning, I found something in the closet that made my stomach drop. A newspaper article with a headline that changed everything. The next morning, I explored the house. Dusty cabinets, warped floors, and an eerie quiet surrounded me. In the hallway closet, I found a small, worn box tucked in a corner. Inside were yellowed newspapers dating back years. My fingers paused over one, and the headline screamed, "Local family disappears from farmhouse. No signs of struggle." Beneath it was a photo. My house. My blood ran cold. According to the article, a husband, wife, and teenage daughter vanished without warning, leaving belongings behind. Neighbors reported hearing nothing unusual and said the family had supposedly moved, though they had left everything intact. It didn't make sense. I folded the paper carefully and put it back, trying to steady my breathing. Maybe that was why the auction price had been so low. Shaking off the unease, I went about exploring. The living room had thick dust layers, and the furniture left behind seemed like frozen moments of time. I opened drawers, peered into cupboards, and tried to imagine what life had been like here. Yet every step carried an underlying tension, as if the house itself were waiting for me to stumble. Eventually, I approached the basement door. Hidden in the back hallway, half obscured by a storage cabinet, it looked ordinary, except for the 3 thick bolts across the outside. Not inside. Not in the usual way a locked basement is secured. These bolts didn't keep people out. They kept something in. I pressed my ear to the door. A faint humming, maybe the old water heater? My imagination? I didn't know, but I decided I would wait until daytime before investigating further. Later that afternoon, I spoke with a local neighbor while taking out trash. His eyes narrowed as I mentioned the McCreary house. "You're sure you want that place?" he asked slowly. I shrugged. He shook his head, muttering something under his breath I couldn't hear. A warning, or just old town gossip? By nightfall, the first storm rolled in. I lit candles and tried to read, but every flicker of shadow seemed alive. And then I heard it again. That low, hollow thud from below. Something, or someone, moving behind that basement door. My pulse raced, my rational mind yelling that it was the house, the boards, the wind. But a small, stubborn part of me wondered, what could possibly be locked behind that basement door? And why had no one entered it for decades? The next morning, I couldn't resist the pull of the basement. That door, with its thick bolts, had a presence that demanded attention. I inspected it closely. The rusted metal and worn wood suggested it hadn't been opened in decades. Who would lock a basement from the outside? What were they hiding? My curiosity wrestled with the fear coiling in my chest. I tried to remove the bolts myself, but they barely budged. That's when I decided to call Frank, the owner of the local hardware store. A wiry man with hands perpetually smudged with grease, he agreed to come over. When he arrived, he examined the bolts with a frown. "These aren't meant to keep people out," he said slowly. "They're meant to keep something in." I laughed nervously, though the words sent a shiver down my spine. With some effort and the right tools, Frank eventually removed the locks. The door groaned open, releasing a cold, stale draft. I shined my flashlight down the narrow stairs. The basement was smaller than I imagined, roughly 10 by 10, with a dirt floor and a disconnected old furnace. In the corner, something metallic glimmered. I descended carefully. The glimmer turned out to be a tin lunchbox. Inside were yellowed papers, a cracked photograph, and a tarnished locket. The photo depicted a man, woman, and teenage girl, the McCreary family from the newspaper article. The locket was engraved with the initials EM. Beneath it were handwritten notes, shaky and desperate. "If you find this, please forgive us." We thought the noise was coming from the walls, but it was deeper. We couldn't let it out. I shivered, unsure whether to call someone or run. Frank asked about the notes, but I couldn't speak them aloud. That air of secrecy hung heavily in the room, thick as dust. I left the basement that day with the tin box, feeling a strange responsibility. That night, the house seemed colder than usual. The floorboards above the basement creaked as if someone paced down there, yet the room remained empty. I tried to sleep, but every small sound seemed amplified. The humming I'd heard earlier returned faintly, steady, unnerving. And then, the next morning, I discovered the basement door had opened on its own. The morning sunlight filtered through the cracked blinds, but the house felt anything but ordinary. I stepped cautiously toward the basement door. It stood open, though I was certain I'd closed it the night before. A cold draft escaped, brushing against my face. The tin lunchbox I had left in the corner now sat on the bottom step, as if it had been moved. I picked it up slowly. Inside, there was something new. A Polaroid photo. I had not taken it. It showed my living room exactly as it looked now, except for a shadowy figure standing by the window. My own figure appeared in it, unnervingly lifelike, frozen in the same posture I held now. I dropped the box in shock. Over the following days, subtle, unsettling things kept happening. Tools I'd left in one place were neatly stacked somewhere else. The radio in the living room occasionally turned on by itself, always tuned to static. And then there was the lavender scent, faint but unmistakable, lingering in the hallways. The same fragrance clinging to the locket. I considered leaving, selling the house, cutting my losses. But a part of me couldn't walk away. I needed answers. I spent hours at the county records office, uncovering the McCreary family's long history with the property. The deeds traced the house back to 1948. The last record before the auction, marked abandoned in 2006, offered no explanation. It was as though the house had swallowed the family whole. That night, around 2 a.m., the porch light flickered. Through the curtains, I glimpsed the silhouette of a figure at the end of the driveway. They didn't move. They didn't leave. They just watched. When I blinked, it was gone. My heart pounded as I questioned my sanity. I tried to tell myself these were coincidences, the result of my imagination or the old house settling. But deep down, I knew there was more. Something about this house wanted to be discovered. Or maybe it didn't want to be. By the next evening, I wasn't alone anymore. Something in the basement had shifted, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. The next afternoon, a knock at the door startled me. Standing there was the sheriff, a middle-aged man with sharp, kind eyes. "Heard you bought the McCreary place," he said, his tone measured. "Everything all right out here?" I forced a calm smile. "Fine," I said, though my voice sounded shaky even to me. He studied me quietly for a moment. "Listen, I know you've probably heard stories. Folks in town don't like to talk about it much, but when that family disappeared, we found the basement sealed like you did. No signs of them ever leaving. No signs of struggle either. House locked from the inside." I swallowed hard. "Do people talk about the noises, the strange things?" The sheriff shook his head. "It's better if you make up your own mind. Most who buy the place don't stay long." After he left, I felt both reassured and more unsettled than ever. The basement door loomed at the end of the hallway. Bolts now removed, its presence commanding. The tin box rested on the counter, unopened. I avoided it for hours, pretending everything was normal. That night, as rain hammered the roof, I tried to sleep in the living room. Every sound, the creaking of the floorboards, the wind through the broken shutters, the faint tapping from the basement, seemed magnified. I could no longer tell whether the sounds were natural or whether something or someone was deliberately making them. I sat up and whispered to the house, "What do you want?" Silence. And then a slow, low creak from below. The basement door shifted slightly as if responding. I realized that staying away from it was no longer an option. Curiosity, fear, and something darker, maybe responsibility, what pulled me toward the basement. I had to know what had happened to the McCreary family. When I finally descended the stairs, what I found in the basement was far more unsettling than I could have imagined. I switched on my flashlight and took a slow step down the stairs. The air smelled damp and metallic. The basement, dim and enclosed, seemed smaller than ever. The old furnace sat in one corner, long disconnected. The tin lunchbox rested where it had been left, but inside something new caught my eye. A small envelope neatly folded, tucked beneath the papers I had seen before. I opened it carefully. The handwriting was shaky, hurried, and almost unreadable. It said, "If you're reading this, you are not alone." We tried to contain it, but it was always deeper than the walls. "Be careful. Do not trust the sounds." A chill ran down my spine. I read it again, trying to make sense of the warning. Something had been hidden here. Something dangerous, or at least profoundly disturbing. The notes suggested awareness that the basement itself held a secret. As I processed the message, a faint scraping sound echoed across the dirt floor. I froze, ears straining. The sound stopped. I moved forward cautiously, flashlight sweeping the room. Everything seemed in its place, yet the air felt charged as if the house was alive. I spent hours that day examining every corner, every creak, every shadow. The Polaroid from before remained on the counter upstairs. I dared not touch it again. The notes and locket suggested the McCreary family knew more than they could ever say. Night fell again. The storm returned, tapping the windows and flooding the house with shadows. I sat on the couch, unable to sleep. My mind kept returning to the basement. What had the family been hiding? Why seal it from the inside? And what or who had left the Polaroid? Just before dawn, I heard a sound I could not explain. Footsteps upstairs, moving toward the basement door. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the living room floor. My heart leapt. The house was supposed to be empty. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the basement door, trying to steady my breathing. The steps stopped as suddenly as they began. Silence. I waited, every muscle tense. The wind rattled the windows, but the noise I had heard was heavier, more deliberate. Human, maybe not human. A shadow flickered along the wall, and I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The dim glow revealed nothing at first, just the familiar shapes of furniture and the staircase. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a faint outline near the window. A figure standing up perfectly still, staring at the basement door. My mind raced. Could it be a neighbor? The sheriff? Someone else from town? Curious about the house's reputation? But no. The figure was too still, too silent, and its posture was unnatural. I tried to speak, my voice barely a whisper. "Who's there?" Nothing. I moved closer, flashlight shaking. The figure flickered again and disappeared. Not out the window, not into the shadows, but vanished entirely. My stomach twisted. I realized then that whatever had occupied this house before me wasn't gone. It lingered, unseen, waiting. The tin lunchbox, the notes, the Polaroid, they all suddenly made sense. The McCreary family had tried to contain it. The basement wasn't just a room, it was a secret, a warning. I debated leaving immediately, selling the house, abandoning everything. But a stubborn need to understand, to face the mystery, kept me rooted. The basement door loomed at the end of the hallway, more than wooden bolts. It was a threshold I couldn't ignore. The night stretched long, the storm intensifying outside. The house creaked, tapped, and whispered in ways no normal structure should. I kept telling myself it was my imagination, but deep down, I knew the house was alive, aware, and watching. By morning, I found something on the kitchen counter that froze me in place. A Polaroid that shouldn't exist, showing me, and someone else standing right behind me. Morning arrived with pale sunlight cutting through the blinds, but the unease didn't fade. On the counter lay the Polaroid. My figure stood as expected, but behind me, faint and shadowed, was another presence. I hadn't taken this photo. I hadn't invited anyone into the house. And yet, the evidence was undeniable. I approached the basement door slowly, flashlight in hand. The bolts were gone, but the door itself seemed heavier, more imposing. Something in the basement had shifted during the night, waiting. My breath quickened. I wanted to flee, but my curiosity anchored me. As I descended the stairs, the room felt charged, electric. The furnace sat silent in one corner. The tin lunchbox lay untouched, but the notes inside seemed to glow with significance under my flashlight. I read them again. We tried to contain it, but it was deeper than the walls. I could almost feel the weight of decades pressing down. A sudden tapping echoed from the far corner. Slow, methodical. I froze. The air was colder than before, heavier. It felt alive. I didn't see anyone, yet the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. Something, or someone, had been locked in this basement long ago. The McCreary family had sealed it from the outside, and the house itself seemed intent on preserving the secret. Hours passed in tense stillness. I debated leaving, but the house whispered for me to stay, to understand. I realized the mystery wasn't meant to be solved entirely, at least not by me. Its presence lingered just out of reach, leaving only clues, the notes, the Polaroid, the locked door. I left the basement finally, the air lighter but charged with unresolved tension. The figure in the Polaroid remained in my mind, a reminder that the house had stories that may never fully reveal themselves. I didn't know if I would stay or go. The McCreary house had claimed my curiosity, perhaps my imagination, but it had also made one thing clear. Some mysteries are meant to be lived with, not solved. I closed the door behind me and stepped into the morning light, unsure of what exactly awaited beneath. The basement remained locked, the house quiet, but I knew deep down it was only a matter of time before it whispered again.